When most people read Genesis today, they usually approach it with modern questions. Questions about science, evolution, the age of the earth, or the length of the creation days often dominate the discussion. Those questions are understandable, but they can sometimes distract us from another question that would have been immediately obvious to Genesis' original audience. What kind of God is this account describing? One of the challenges modern readers face is that we often read Genesis in isolation. We imagine someone opening a Bible and encountering the creation account for the first time, but the ancient world was already full of creation stories. The Babylonians had their stories, the Egyptians had theirs, the Canaanites had their own explanations for how the world came into existence and what the gods were like. Genesis enters that conversation, but what is remarkable is not merely that it offers a different explanation for the origin of the world. What is remarkable is that it presents a completely different understanding of God. Consider how many ancient creation stories begin. The gods struggle, they compete, they fight for power, they overcome rivals. Creation itself often emerges from conflict. One of the best-known examples is the Babylonian creation account known as the Enuma Elish. In that story, the god Marduk defeats Tiamat, a goddess associated with the sea and chaos. After killing her, he divides her body and fashions the heavens and the earth from her remains. The details may sound strange to modern ears, but the underlying idea is important. The world exists because one god defeated another. Creation is born from violence. The universe itself is constructed from the remains of a divine being. Genesis could hardly be more different. The opening sentence simply says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." No battle occurs, no rival appears, no threat emerges, no explanation is given for where God came from or how he achieved his position. The narrative simply assumes his existence and his authority. That alone would have been a striking contrast to many of the surrounding creation accounts. Yet there is another difference that is perhaps even more significant. In many ancient myths, creation costs the gods something. The world is made from a divine body, divine substance, or the remains of a defeated deity. Something must be divided, something must be destroyed, something must be diminished so that the world can exist. Genesis presents a God who creates without loss. Nothing is taken from him to make the universe. No part of God becomes the oceans. No part of God becomes the stars. No part of God becomes the earth. God remains fully God before creation and fully God after creation. This may seem like a small detail, but it reveals something profound about how Genesis understands God. Human beings cannot create this way. Every act of human creation involves transforming something that already exists. A builder needs materials. A sculptor needs stone. An artist needs paint. We rearrange what is already present. Genesis presents a God who does something entirely different. He speaks, "Let there be light," and there is light. The simplicity of that statement can make us miss how extraordinary it is. The text is presenting a God whose power is not dependent upon resources. He is not constructing the universe from pre-existing materials. He is not reshaping himself into creation. He simply wills creation into existence. The act of creation does not diminish him. In fact, creation reveals his greatness precisely because it costs him nothing. This is one of the reasons Genesis presents a God who exists in a completely different category from the gods of the surrounding cultures. He is not simply stronger than they are. He is not merely wiser than they are. He is not one powerful being among many powerful beings. He is the source from which everything else derives its existence. The distinction becomes even more interesting when we reach the fourth day of creation. Modern readers tend to pass over the creation of the sun, moon, and stars without giving it much thought. To us, they are simply objects in the sky. Ancient people did not think that way. Throughout the ancient Near East, heavenly bodies were often associated with divine powers. The sun was worshipped. The moon was worshipped. The stars were connected to gods, destinies, and spiritual forces. Much of the ancient world looked upward and saw divinity. Against that backdrop, Genesis does something surprisingly subtle. It does not even use the common names for the sun and moon. Instead, it refers to them simply as the greater light and the lesser light. At first glance, this may seem insignificant, but it appears to be intentional. Genesis is stripping away the divinity that surrounding cultures attach to these heavenly bodies. The sun is not a god, the moon is not a god, the stars are not gods. They are created things. More than that, Genesis presents them as servants rather than rulers. They mark seasons, days, and years. They provide light. They perform functions assigned to them by the Creator. This is another quiet but profound challenge to the worldview of the surrounding nations. The things people worship are not gods at all. The things people fear are not ultimate powers. They are under God's authority. The sun obeys him, the moon obeys him, the stars obey him. Even the sea, which often represented chaos and danger in ancient cultures, exists because God created it. Genesis is systematically removing divinity from every corner of creation and directing attention toward the Creator alone. The same pattern appears in the creation of humanity. In several ancient myths, human beings exist primarily to serve the needs of the gods. The gods create humanity because they need laborers. Humanity is useful because it relieves the gods of burdens they no longer wish to carry. Genesis again moves in an entirely different direction. Human beings are created in the image of God. That phrase has become so familiar that it is easy to miss how radical it would have sounded in the ancient world. Rather than existing as slaves to meet divine needs, humanity is given dignity, responsibility, and purpose. Human beings are not created because God needs something from them. They are created because God chooses to share his creation with them. The repeated declaration that creation is good reinforces the same point. The world is not the accidental result of divine conflict. It is not cosmic debris left over from a heavenly battle. It is not a prison. It is not an afterthought. It is the intentional work of a good creator. Perhaps the most fascinating part of all this is that modern readers often fail to recognize how unusual these ideas actually are. When most people hear the word God today, they tend to assume certain things. They assume God is all-powerful. They assume he is not dependent upon creation. They assume he is morally good. They assume he stands above nature rather than being part of it. They assume he created the universe rather than emerging from it. To many people, these ideas feel almost self-evident. Historically, they were not. For much of human history, gods were commonly imagined as larger versions of human beings. They possessed greater power, but they also possessed human weaknesses. They fought, they lusted, they feared, they deceived, they competed. The picture of God found in Genesis is dramatically different. Genesis presents a God who is not merely stronger than other gods. He is not merely wiser than other gods. He is not one powerful being among many powerful beings. He exists in an entirely different category. He is the creator of everything else that exists. In many ways, the influence of Genesis has been so extensive that modern people often mistake this understanding of God for the default human understanding of God. We assume people have always thought this way. They have not. The worldview introduced in Genesis would eventually shape Judaism, Christianity, and later Islam. The idea of a single creator who stands above creation, is not dependent upon creation, and rules over all things became foundational to all three Abrahamic faiths. As a result, many of the assumptions people make about God today, even among those who are not particularly religious, have been influenced by ideas that can be traced back to the worldview Genesis presents. The irony is that Genesis became so influential that many people no longer recognize how revolutionary its picture of God actually was. When modern people hear the opening words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," they often think, "Of course." But for much of human history, there was no "of course." There were gods of rivers, gods of storms, gods of fertility, gods of war, gods who fought, gods who failed, gods who could be tricked, gods who could be defeated. Genesis begins by sweeping all of that aside. Before there are mountains, oceans, stars, nations, kings, or even humanity itself, there is God. Not a god among many, not the strongest member of a divine family, not a victorious survivor of some cosmic struggle. Simply God, the one from whom everything else derives its existence. Yet there is an interesting implication that follows from all of this. The gods of the ancient world often needed something. They needed sacrifices, they needed laborers, they needed servants, they needed someone to meet their needs. The God of Genesis needs nothing. That means creation is not an act of necessity. God did not create because he was lonely. He did not create because he lacked companionship. He did not create because he required workers. He did not create because he was incomplete. Creation exists because God chose for it to exist. Humanity exists because God chose for humanity to exist. The universe itself is not the result of divine need. It is the result of divine generosity. That observation changes the way we think about God. A God who needs nothing and yet creates is fundamentally different from a God who creates because he lacks something. The first creates out of abundance. The second creates out of need. Genesis presents the first. There is another implication that often goes unnoticed. Throughout history, people have tended to become like the things they worship. Cultures shaped by gods who were violent often became comfortable with violence. Cultures shaped by gods who were deceptive often became comfortable with deception. The character of a society is frequently influenced by the character of its gods. Genesis presents a God who is sovereign rather than anxious, generous rather than needy, life-giving rather than exploitative, good rather than capricious. If the object of worship shapes the worshiper, then the God revealed in Genesis points humanity toward an entirely different vision of life than the gods of the surrounding nations. Yet there is an irony here. While modern people no longer worship the sun and moon, we still have a tendency to assign ultimate importance to created things. Ancient people often feared the forces of nature because they believed divine power resided within them. Modern people may place that same ultimate significance elsewhere: success, wealth, political power, technology, relationships, and personal fulfillment, even ourselves. The objects change, but the temptation remains remarkably similar. We continue looking to creation for what only the Creator can provide. We continue taking things that are good and treating them as ultimate. Genesis challenges all of those tendencies. The God of Genesis is not dependent upon creation. He is not sustained by creation. He is not diminished by creation. He is not threatened by creation. He is not merely the strongest being in existence. He is the source of existence itself. Perhaps that is why the Bible begins where it does. Before it tells us about humanity, before it tells us about sin, before it tells us about Abraham, before it tells us about Israel, before it tells us about redemption, it tells us who God is. Because every misunderstanding that follows in Scripture ultimately traces back to a misunderstanding of God. And every act of faith begins with seeing Him more clearly. When Genesis is read against the backdrop of the ancient world, it becomes apparent that its primary achievement is not simply providing an account of how the world began. Its primary achievement is revealing a God unlike anything humanity would have imagined on its own. A God who speaks and worlds appear. A God who creates without loss. A God who needs nothing yet gives everything. A God who stands above creation while remaining involved with it. A God who remains complete, sovereign, and undiminished. The ancient world had many stories about powerful gods. Genesis presents something entirely different. It presents God.